as well as the rest of the empire, was occupied by the Ottoman Turks. And another page of the history of the area started. About the same time, the very Catholic rulers of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabel, issued the Decree of Granada, forcing all Jews of the empire into expulsion or in changing religion to Christianity. That was in 1492. And fortunately, the Sultan in Constantinople, he had a Jewish advisor, a Jewish doctor, and he gave him very favorable information about the Jews, because the Turks were totally isolated. They didn't have very much information about what was happening in Western Europe. So he allowed the Jews to settle in his towns, and it is said that the Sultan said, "How foolish of the monarchs of Spain to impoverish their empire while enriching mine." Most of these people that came in were poor people, but there were a lot of well-educated scholars, doctors, etc. So during the early 16th century, what is now Greece and Turkey became a haven for the Jews that were persecuted from the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, from Provence in the south of France, from the south of Italy, from Germany and Central Europe. And you can see how all the arrows converged towards one main city, and that was Salonika. So the origins of the Jews of Greece is multiple. The original settlers were called Romagnots, from Romans, and you are looking at a rare specimen. Most of the Jews from Greece came from Spain, and they are called Sephardim because that's the Hebrew name for Spain. There's a group that came from Provence and Italy, and then there were the Ashkenazim. There were very few, and quickly got assimilated to the Sephardim rites. In the 16th century, Salonika was called Jerusalem of the Balkans because of it was a religious center, but also Mother of Israel, because all persecuted Jews from all over Europe would settle in Salonika. One of the first printing presses in the area was established in Salonika towards the end of about 1498. And you can see a copy in the far right of your screen, a copy of one of the first Agada stories of Passover, which was printed in Salonika in the early 16th century, and a much later copy which is printed in Hebrew, Greek, and Ladino. Ladino is the corrupted Spanish that the Jews from Spain were speaking. But still there were manuscripts because there were not too many printing presses. Incidentally, the Turks, the Ottomans, did not allow printing of their own holy books until the late 19th century. So that kept them way behind, not only in terms of religion, but in terms of education. And this is a very interesting manuscript from Crete, which is made in what is described as a Byzantine style, and with a little twist of Venetian and Genovese, because the Italians were there at the time. Religious life was unrestricted. Salonika was one of the major religious and Kabbalah centers of Europe. And even there, the pseudo-messiah, Subtites V, he came up from a family from Smyrna, I believe. He was born in Smyrna, but his father was from Patras. And he preached that he was the Messiah. He had a lot of followers. The sultans forced him to denounce his, what he was saying, or to convert to Islam. And ultimately he converted to Islam. The interesting thing that all his followers are called in Turkish donme, which is converts. and you can see a picture of an old man over there. Even these people were deported to concentration, or whatever were left, because most left Turkey, were deported to the concentration camps, despite the fact that they were Muslims for 3 centuries. There were prominent physicians, as I said. This is a picture of the Moses Hamon was the Sultan's physician, personal physician. The Sultan wouldn't go anywhere without him. And it's the whole family, because for 3 generations, they were him and his children were the physicians for the Sultan and the court. And then there is this man on the other side called Amatus Lusitanus. He was a Marano, meaning a convert, but maintaining his religion. And he was the most eminent physician of his time. He had translated all the books of Hippocrates, Dioscurides, and others, but he added a lot, and he practiced for a while in Salonika. And they were very important, influential people. As I said earlier, the Turks didn't have, at this time, 16th century, they didn't still have ambassadors to the courts in Western Europe. So it was the Jewish merchants and the Jews from prominent families, when they were traveling to Europe, that were coming back, summoned to the palace to find out what was going, or become intermediate between the kings, as you will see in a minute, and the Sultan. And this is the story of this lady, Dona Gracia Mendes Nasi. She was from Portugal, and she was a Marana. She married to this very wealthy merchant of spices. When her husband died, she turned back to Judaism, and she left Portugal. She traveled all over Europe. She was hostage in Venice for a couple of years. She financed the printing of the first European Bible in Ferrara, Italy. And then, as you can see her trail, she ended up in Salonika, and then in Constantinople. And she was one of the advisors to the Sultan. And also her nephew, Joseph Nasi, because of his connections with the courts in Europe, he was given not only the title, but actually he became the ruler of a group of islands. As you can see in the bottom, there's a circle of islands, and those are the Cyclades. So he became the Duke of Naxos for a period of about 50 years. This was the highest ranking Jewish official all over Europe, and the world actually. The costumes were Oriental. There were no restrictions except that the Jews were supposed to wear a yellow turban, with one exception, the physicians. The physicians had a red turban as the rest of the Turks, and that demonstrates what esteem the Turks had to the physicians. They didn't have too many anyway. The ladies were not supposed to wear a veil, but they had a head cover, and very few, as Dona Gracia, as I showed you earlier, was allowed to wear European clothes, as you see the far slide. If you go to the museum, to the Jewish Museum in Greece, you will see a very fine collection of dresses of this time. With the years, the Ottoman Empire was getting weaker, and the Greeks started thinking of their own country, and in 1821, the Greek Revolution against the Ottomans started. Korais was an eminent philosopher and thinker from Chios, who lived in Paris. And he was asked to review the provisional first Greek constitution, where, among others, there were sections about the foreigners living in what would become Greece. And so he came up with some concrete ideas, particularly for the Jews, and he said that he felt that everyone born in Greece should be considered a Greek citizen. And the ones that don't speak the language, you should give them a time of preparation for a couple of generations, but definitely by then they should all become equal, occupy political offices. Of course, Corais was influenced by the French Revolution, and he was saying these things at the time that Napoleon was the first ruler in Europe that emancipated the Jews. So this was the foundation for the constitution of the modern Greek state, which was much smaller than what Greece is now, just the lower southern part of Greece. And the Jews within the new Greek state were allowed to work and practice their religion without restrictions. They spoke Greek. They had all the privilege and obligation of their Orthodox compatriots. They had, with few exceptions, a good relation with the Greek population, and they observed the Sabbath and the holidays. In the eve of the 20th century, there were 27 organized Jewish communities in Greece. That was after the expansion of the Greek state north, and when Salonika and the rest of the north was incorporated within the Greek state. There were schools, synagogues, community centers, anything you can imagine. And the population at the time was over 100,000. There were synagogues, beautiful synagogues, and it's very interesting to see in every city the style is different. This is the synagogue in Ioannina, this is the synagogue in Corfu. Because of the influence of the Venetians, it looks like the synagogues in Venice. The synagogue in Athens, the synagogue in Rhodes is actually the oldest actual synagogue on Greek soil, modern synagogue, 15th century. And if you look at the yard and you take a walk in the yard, you can see the mandros, the Greek sign, right in the courtyard. There were wonderful religious leaders. The religious life was unrestricted, as we said. There were religious objects and artifacts, Torah scrolls. There is a difference between the rite of the Romagnots, the old Jews, and the rest of the world. The Torah is supposed to be read standing, and so there are these wood cases which are wonderfully decorated. This is from Ioannina, the other one is from Crete, and again, because of the Venetians, you can see the Italian influence. And there are all sorts of religious objects. Those are marriage contracts to the left and to the right, circumcision certificates called Aleph. And our traditions are different than the traditions of the Ashkenaz Jews in many ways, in all the rituals, including Passover, the major Jewish holiday. I was shocked first coming to the United States when I was invited to a Seder and they served me fish, gefilte fish, and I said, what's going on? The books talk about Paschal Lamb, and that's what we have. And there were wonderful institutions, schools. The Alliance Israélite Universelle was a French organization established in Paris, because you have to appreciate that the vast majority of the Jews were poor. And so this organization was established to help the poor children get education. Kids finishing these schools were fluent in Greek, French, and Hebrew. And the ones in Salonika, Ladino. Jews participate in the political life, and you can see the picture of the rabbi of Salonika marching with the Orthodox clergy and the Muslim imams during the funeral of King George I in Salonika. You can see a picture of the rabbi in the entrance of the Metropolitan Church in Athens during the New Year's ceremony in 1928. But also, please look to the far right. Jews immediately after the Salonika entering the Greek state in 1912 or 13, they were allowed to vote. And Jews participate in the government. There were, until the war, until the Second World War, there were 2 to 4 deputies from Salonika primarily, Jewish deputies in the Greek parliament. And of course, the Greeks were a microcosm of the political spectrum in Greece, so there were royalists and there were communists. As Avram Ben-Aroya, who was the founder of the Socialist Party of Greece, which ultimately became, in 1921, the Communist Party of Greece. And the family life, there were poor people, but primarily there were some rich people, but primarily there were poor people. The same thing in the homes. You go to Salonika, you still see some wonderful mansions, but primarily the Jews were poor and in small areas, no ghettos. Weddings were wonderful events for the community. The whole community was invited, particularly in the small towns. And holidays were very important. Purim, the holiday of Esther, was very appealing because Esther is the queen that saved the Jews, so every Jewish kid wanted to be, or girl wanted to be dressed as Queen Esther, but also they were dressed with Greek costumes, as you see in the bottom. And there were prominent Jews, but as I said, most of the Jews were poor, were peddlers, were merchants. And yes, there were some farmers around the area of Salonika, which is unheard of for the Jews in Europe. Salonika was really a wonderful cultural center, as Ms. Bura said. The first newspaper in Salonika was printed in Ladino in 1860. In the turn of the century, there were about 40 different newspapers in Greek, in Ladino, in Hebrew, and in French. And then there were some older Jews that still used, they didn't know the meaning of the Jewish language, but they knew how to write it. So this is, if you know how to read it, it's in Greek. It's Greek. That's from Yanina. And there were poets like Yosef Elias from Yanina. There were painters. There were Giulio Caimi. There were historians. And there was music. Wonderful Sepharad music, which is very close to Oriental, Greek, and Turkish music. But also, there were Jews who were participating in Greek music companies. In the top, there is this famous singer, Rosa Eskenazi. And there were theaters. What I'm trying to say, and sports clubs, the Jews were part of the